Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Yomi. We're starting about 12 lines down at Amar Le Rav the Rav Acha Bardula. We'll be going until the end of the parak. We have a lot of ground to cover. Let us jump right in. We've been in the discussion of Maimed Shlashton. Let's review what the basic case of Maimed Shlashton is, because that's going to be the crux of the first Amud today. Maimed Shlashton is, if I lend you money, that means you owe me money. So if you owe me money and I owe someone else money, let's just make a shortcut and you'll just give it straight to the third party. So the Gemara says in the name of Rav that this is kana. As long as all three people are present, standing in a triangle together, if I say, let's just use Michael, instead of paying me back, just pay back Gerald straight, that is a kinyan. Afal Pida, there was no Mashicha, there was no Hagba, there was no Kinyan Sudar. Maisa, Maimed Shlashtan works. On that note, the Gemara starts out again, 10, 12 lines down, Yadalat Amadala. Amar le Rav le Rav Acha Bardula, Kaba de Morika Isli Gabach. I have a little bit of spices, saffron. I have a little bit of spices in your house, and I actually owe them to someone else. Yave leploni, I'd like you to give it to person X, and be'ape ka'amin alach, and I'm saying it in front of the third party, because Delo Hadron Abi, so that I don't retract my opinion. This is seemingly a classical case of Maimed Shlashtan. I owe you some morika, and okay, so let's just Maimed Shlashtan. Let's remember that the Maimed Shlashtan works in a magical way. The Gemara said yesterday in an odd conclusion that Maimed Shlashtan works across the boards no matter what the circumstances are. Very odd Gemara. It was a halacha below taima. Nevertheless, it works. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Michlal, what's implied from this line when it says that maybe I might return, maybe I might change my mind, is Michlal de'iboy hadarbe, matzar hadarbe. That if a person wants to retract, and if a person wants to undo the Maimed Shlashtan, he'd be able. And that's not right. Our presumption about Maimed Shlashtan is that it's a proper kinyan, and once it takes effect, and there's no backseas, it's just done. So if we're standing in that triangle of people, and I say, instead of paying me back, pay the third party, pay Levi, so then the din is that they should get paid back with no chance of there being a chazara. So the Gemara says, you're absolutely right, don't worry. Hachi kamar, this is pshat in the line that Rav Acha Bardula was talking about. Actually, Rav said it to Rav Acha Bardula. Hachi kamar dvarim halalu lo nitna lechazara. He said that I'm doing it in front of you because there's no way to do chazara, and therefore we can stay true to form that that you're not allowed to do chazara, that the kinyan of Maimed Shlashtan is binding. Says the Gemara, that's very nice, but Rav already taught this to us. Ha'amar Rav Chadazimna. Rav's telling us a story now, but Rav already taught this halacha, and we don't waste Rav's words. The Amar of Hunamar Rav. That's the basic din, and we presume again from that basic din of Maimed Shlashtan that there is no need for anything else. That kinyan is a binding kinyan. So says the Gemara, we actually needed both comments. We needed the primary comment that we just saw of kana, and we need the story that we just saw. Why? Because if I only would have had the primary line of Rav, that Maimed Shlashtan is kana, I might have thought that's only true by larger transactions. Aval, matana muetes, but with a smaller transaction like this, kaba de morika, this little bit of bag of spices that I left by your house, I might have thought lowly bay b'fanav. I might have thought that I don't need the third party to be present in front of me, kamash malan, that Maimed Shlashtan works the same, whether it's a matana meruba or a matana muetes, it works the same under all circumstances, and that is that if all three people are present, and only if all three people are present, Maimed Shlashtan works, and that is halachically true today. Maimed Shlashtan works right now too. So if you're standing in a circle and in a triangle of people, and the case scenarios where you owe money to person B, so then the Maimed Shlashtan is actually binding, and you should be careful because that's a real kinyan. And in fact, the following story will show us some implications of that. Halfway down, not even, a little bit more than a third of the way down in Yudal, there were a bunch of gardeners. They were counting all of the money that they had made from the master of the property. One person had 5 istri zuze. It's a unit of coins. 5, let's call it 5 quarters, $5, doesn't matter, 5 bills. And one of them seemed to have a little bit of extra money. They were all counting the singles. He had too much money. So Amre Le, the other gardeners, said to him, Havinhu nehale lemare ara. You should give it back to the master of the property, whoever it is, the owner of the house. Give it back. And he did so. Ba'ape mare ara. He did it in front of the master. right, in front of the guy who owned it, and v'kanu minei, and there was a kinyan that was done as well. So this was seemingly, why do the kinyan? We had ma'amad shlashton. Okay, l'sov, this guy gets back to his apartment later that day. Azal, avad chushbana, bein dilei lenafshe. When he got home, he's like, you know what? Something doesn't feel right. This satchel of money feels too light for me to have 5 extra coins. And what did he find out? Really, lo pashka velo midi. Really, there was no extra money. Now, he hadn't paid the money yet. He had just made a commitment to pay the money. So the question is, what happens now? He didn't know what to do. So like any good Ben Torah would do, went to ask a shayla. Asa the kamet Rav Nachman. Amar lei, ma yavet lach. Rav Nachman said, what can I do? You've got yourself completely trapped. Chada de amar Rav Huna amar Rav. First of all, you're stuck because of general ma'amad shlashton. You stood there with the master of the property, and you were there with the other guys as well. It's a ma'amad shlashton scenario. Kana. It's kanan with no chazar, no backsies. We already learned that in the first part of the Gemara today. Not only that, but another type of kinyan was done. You're doubly dead in the water. You need to pay the extra 5 coins. So says the Gemara, Amarle Rava, I don't understand. Rava was the next generation. Rav Nachman was 3rd century Amoraim. Rava was 4th century. So really, Rava heard about this psak from Rav Nachman the generation later. This was not happening in real time for Rava. But Rava said, I don't understand. The guy's not saying I'm not willing to. He's like, it's not that he's not willing to keep halacha. It's deleka kaboy kamar. He's saying the money that I thought was in my pocket is not in my pocket. In other words, I made a kinyan on money that doesn't exist. We all made a math error. I thought that I had the extra 5 coins. I didn't have the extra 5 coins. So Rava says to Rav Nachman, why are you forcing him to pay? He didn't even have the money at the end of the day. So says the Gemara, Amar lei im kain, says Rav Nachman back to Rava, you're right, im kain. If it's true, then it's kinyan v'ta'osu. If it's just that we thought that he had the money and really he didn't have the money, then you can ma'amad shlashton all day long. It doesn't matter. You're making a kinyan on a house of cards. There's nothing to talk about. The chol kinyan b'taos choser. So we've learned a couple of interesting things. I'm just curious, as a side note, what was Rav Nachman missing in the initial part of the story that Rava had to explain it to him? That's not clear from the Gemara. Don't know. It wasn't a difficult sugya, right? We must be missing something. What was Rav Nachman's having? Second of all, what we've learned is that ma'amad shlashton only works when there's a metzias, right? It doesn't break the rules of nature. There has to be money to be had. If I stand there in a circle and I say, yes, I would like you to give money to the third party, and there's no money to speak of, that's not ma'amad shlashton. You just don't know what you're talking about. So these are some practical halachos. Small toast was what? Yeah. Okay, but that's not what the Gemara says.
So the kinyan that was made.
But that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says.
He's trying to explain. Tosha seems to have your question. It really seems so
correct.
Simple.
That is the question. Lo pashka velo midi. That's what the Gemara says.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I don't know. I'm wrong, so it doesn't matter. Chalipin. A kinyan chalipin is where we do one action to represent a purchase. It's a representative type of kinyan. If you've ever seen like a kinyan sudar, you'll see at the signing of a ksuba, you'll see someone pick up a pen. So those are similar. Chalipin is where we take one item that represents a purchase of another. So at the 2/3 of the way down, we're going to actually jump to another sugya called holech. And this is where a person doesn't say a classical language of kinyan, but rather a different language of kinyan. 2/3 of the way down, Yadal Aleph Itmar. Holech mana leploni shani chayav lo. Holech, which we loosely translate as bring, even though it's not really the right word. Holech mana leploni shani chayav lo. So Amar Rav says that while the money is being transferred, chayav ba'achrayuso, there's an interesting dichotomy. You're responsible for the money until it gets to the recipient. And but at the same time, if you wanted to retract that money, you are not able to retract that money once you put it in the hand of the shliach. Really, this is a stira, because on the one hand, we're saying you're chayav b'achrayuso until it gets to the recipient, and at the same time that's true, you can't do chazar. Shmuel says no, I disagree. Shmuel Amar mitoch shechayav b'achrayuso im balachzor chozer. They're one and they're two sides. They're all the same thing. It's all the same. If you're chayav b'achrayuso until it gets there, that means it's still yours, and therefore you can do chazara. So machlokes Rav and Shmuel, if you can do chazara in a case of holech. And says the Gemara, Lema b'haka miflage. Perhaps the machlokas is as follows: the Mar Savar holech kizachi dami. That according to one approach, when you say holech, it's kizachi. That's the shita of Rav. That's why you can't be choser. And according to the other shita of Shmuel, Mar Savar holech lav kizachi dami. Saying holech is not like you are zocha. That's why he does allow for chazar. So perhaps that's the machlokas about whether or not we say holech is kizachidami or not. And the Gemara says, lo, that's not correct. Kuli alma holech kizachidami. Everyone agrees that when you say holech, that there is a schus to be had here, and a kinyan was really made. So what then is the machlokas? Really, what the Gemara is saying is Mar Savar lo amrinan migu, Mar Savar amrinan migu. Now we know migu means since, and usually it's employing a certain logic. Take a look at Rashi, just to our right, Abraham Maschil, Shmuel Savar amrinan migu. What's the migu that we say? That mitoch shechai ba'achrayis im balachzor chozer. If this, then that. If you're able, if you are a person who's chai ba'achrayis, so then we say clearly there's some connection between you and this item, therefore you can be choser. Do we say migu or not? Now really there's a kinyan that's made, but we're saying that it obviously wasn't a full kinyan in this case because you were chai b'achrayis. So that's what the Gemara says. And in fact, Tanya Kavase de Rav was of the opinion that you cannot do chazara. We'll see a somewhat lengthy brisa that concludes just like the shita of Rav. Tanya Kavase de Rav, we're 3/4 of the way down. Yadal and Mel. The Gemara says, "Holech mana leploni shani chayav lo." That's one language that you might say. That's the language that we started with. Or Tain mana leploni shani chayav lo. Or Holech mana leploni pikadon sheyesh li biyadi. Give over this item to another person, but really it's a pikadon. I'm giving it over to you to bring it to that other person. Tain mana leploni pikadon sheyesh li biyadi. In all of these cases. So we have a brisa very clearly supporting the shita of Rav, where it says that if you want to do chazar, you're not allowed, and therefore, if we had to conclude, we're not posting, but if we had to conclude, it would seem to be that in the world of holech, if I say holech mana leploni, so then we live in this dichotomous world where on the one hand I'm chai ba'achar yusan until the money gets to the recipient, but at the same time I'm really not a full owner because I can't do chazara. And that's how Rav paskins, and we have a brisa that supports Rav. Again, it's an oddity, and we need Rishonim here to clarify why this level of ownership is bifurcated. That on the one hand, I'm still chayav b'achar yusan until it gets to the recipient, but really, once it reaches the shliach, then I no longer can do chazar. That's a stira. Should be a stira. That's why Shmuel argued. So, nevertheless, that's how Rav paskins. Says the Gemara, I don't understand the case of pikadon. By the case of pikadon, le'malei, perhaps you could argue that you should not have given the pikadon to anybody else because ein mitzono she'e pikadon b'yad acher. Maybe the Baal. Maybe the owner of the Baal Pikadon, the owner, really doesn't want it to be in anybody else's hands. How do you have the right to take it out of the first person's hand? Says the Gemara, in general, you're right. But in this case, what are we talking about? Amar Reb Zera, shehuchsa kafran. The guy who's watching it is a yutz. He doesn't know, he's not a responsible human being. You know, like you ever ask those questions like, how can a person lose a shoe? This is the guy who loses the shoe. So you don't want him watching your stuff. So therefore, it's okay to not return it back to owner. But if it was a responsible person, then you're right. Then you can't give a pikadon. This is like for us. Can you give if somebody entrusts me with their item, am I allowed to have another person be a pikadon while I'm really the Baal Pikadon? No, you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because I was entrusted. If I'm out to lunch, then maybe the halacha would change. Very good. Rav Sheshes, the Gemara is going to tell a couple of stories. Rav Sheshes Havalei Ashrasa Desarbali b'mechoza. He had some money that was to be collected for having sold coats in Mechoza, in the city of Mechoza. He didn't live in Mechoza. So when his friends were going, Amar le Rav Yosef Bar Chama, Bahade de Asis, when you go down, he said to Rav Yosef Bar Chama, when you go to Mechoza, if you wouldn't mind, can you please go pick up the debt that they owe me? They'll give you some rubles, put it in your satchel and bring it back to me when we're all done. Thank you very much. So no problem. Azal. Yahavin Hule, he went to the people who owed the money, and he said, I'm here representing Rav Sheshes, so can you please give me the money that you owe Rav Sheshes? He's a trustworthy individual. They gave him over the money, the rubles that were owed. No problem. So Amre Le, can you do me a favor? Listen, Rav Yosef Bar Chama, you're the person who took the coins off of our hands. We don't want any more responsibility on our head right now. Do you mind? Nikni minach. Can you please make an acquisition from us? In other words, we're the ones who owed the money to Rav Sheshes. You, Rav Yosef, are the shliach. Would you mind, please take this responsibility off my hands and make it that I'm not a Baal Achrayis anymore. I've given it to the shliach. I did my part. So says the Gemara, Amar lehu in, yeah, I'm okay with that. But even though he was okay with it in principle, Lissof at the end of the day, Ishtamet, he ended up getting out of the deal, and he didn't end up doing that. And Ki Asa Legabe, when Rav Yosef Bar Chama returned home with the money to give back to Rav Sheshes, Omar Le Rav Sheshes says to Rav Yosef Bar Chama, Shapir avadet de lo shavis nafshach eved love ishmalbe. You did a good job not making yourself an eved to me. What does that mean? You're just a shliach. The person who has the achrayis is the person who owed me money. Those are the guys who live in Mechoza. They're the ones who are baalei achrayis. They asked you to take on responsibility. That's not your job. Your job is not to be an eved to me. Your job is to do shlichus for me. The responsibility really lies with those people, with the people in Mechoza who actually took my coats and had yet to pay me, so they owed me money. They're the baalei achrayis, and as the coins are in transit, the responsibility lies with the original payer. And Lishna Achrina, another way to understand this is Shapir Avadet Eved Love Leish Malve. You did a good job because the burden should be for the people who were the Love, who were the borrowers. Two iterations of the same thing. But an interesting thing, like you send a package through UPS, they're going to say, what kind of insurance do you want? How does that work halacha l'maisa? So if I was a Yiddish company, I'd say the achrayis lies with the seller, with the shipper. Everything stays with him until it reaches my front door. That's on him. So that's how halacha would probably, again, I'm projecting, but that's based on this Gemara. That's what halacha would say, that unless the shliach takes responsibility, a unique responsibility, then all of the burden lies on the seller, on the shipper. Another story. Rav Achi Bereb Yoshia Havale Iskapa to Kaspa ben Arda. He had some type of cup, some type of vessel. Rashi says it's a kli that was made out of silver and narda. Turning to the top of Yadalat on the base. Amar Luhul Rav Dustai ben Rav Yanai, Ula Rav Yossi bar Kiper. When the two of you, Rav Dustai and Rav Yossi, when you guys go down there, please, Bahade de Asisu, on your way back, Asyu Hanehale, please bring me my silver cup. Thank you very much. Azul Yahve Nehalahu. So these two gentlemen, Rav Dustai and Rav Yossi bar Kiper, they went down. Where did they go? Does it say? Narda. They went to Narda and they went to go collect the cup. Amrei Lahu, the people who are holding onto the cup, says to Rav Dustai and Rav Yossi, do me a favor, nikni minaychu, please take over responsibility for this item, similar to the last story. The guys who were holding onto the cup were saying, I'm giving you the cup as a shliach. I don't want any more achrayis, no more responsibility. Amrei Lahu lo, they said, we're not doing that. That's not happening. So they said, well, if you're not going to take responsibility away from us, then we're holding on to the cup. Then give us the cup back. Because I don't want a case scenario where I'm trusting that you're going to do a good job with shlichus. I know that when the cup's in my house, that it's safe. If he wants to get his cup without shlichus, tell him to come down and get it. But if I have to give it to a shliach, that's unfair. I don't want the responsibility while it's in transit that if something happens to you, I have to give him another silver cup. This is an expensive product. I don't want the responsibility. So here, our shlichim, they started telling different stories. Rav Dustai Reb Yanai Amar Lahu in. He says, no problem, you can have the cup back. But Reb Yossi Bar Kippur Amar Lahu, lo, I'm not giving you the cup back. No way, I'm holding on to the cup. So, like all good Jews, they tied him down to a chair and they started beating him, which is not normal. Amar le, chazi mar hechi ka'avir. This is not normal. They said to Rav Dustai, he said to Rav Dustai, look what's happening. They're beating him up. Amar lahu, Rav Dustai said back to them, Tav, Ramule, keep up the good work. You guys are doing a good beating. I'm proud of you. That's great. Okay, they finally got out of the scenario and they got back to Narda. When they finally got back to, who was it? Rav Achi Rav Yoshia, the owner of the cup. When they finally got back there, Amar le, Chazi mar, Lo mistaya de lo sayin. It wasn't just that Rav Dustai didn't help me when these goons were beating me with a piece of wood. Ella amar lahunami tav ramule. He even said they're doing a great job of beating me up. Well, what kind of person is Rav Dustai? This is not right. So he says to him, Amar le amai te abirachi. Why did you support this beating? It says the Gemara, Amar le osan b'nei adam hein ama v'kovan ama. They are an amatal, and their head is an amatal. And they speak from their midline. They have a very deep voice. In other words, they were very large people, even though one amma is not significant. But the Gemara seems to say that this is a catchphrase of the day. These people are very large. They're terrifying people. And their names are scary. Ooh, what does that even mean that their names? These are grown adults. This is what the Gemara says. Their names are scary. Arda ve'arta upili verish. Okay. And what really was he saying? If they were to say Omrin Kfusu, if these guys were to say to their servants, tie this guy up, then Kofsin, then they do it. And Omrin Harogu, then Horgan. These guys were very scary people. What they said went even to the point of being killed. Ilu Hargu es Dustai. If this is him talking, Rav Dustai. Rav Dustai says, if they would have killed Dustai, if they would have killed me nosan liyanai abba bar kamosi. Who's going to give my father another son like me? I was scared for my life. Amar Le. So Rav Achi says back to him, Bnei Adam halalu krovam l'malchus. These guys, were they like chummy with the kings and with the presidents? Were they all Amar Lahain? Yes, they were. So Yeshlan Susim Uparadim Sheratzin Achareim. Do they have horses and do they have mules that are following them as they travel? Amar Lahain. They have a whole entourage, absolutely. Amar Le Yihachi Shapir Avadat. You did a good job supporting the abuse. Super interesting Gemara for halachic purposes when you're in scenarios supporting other people's physical pain. If you're afraid, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to sacrifice your life. The Gemara seems to say, no, you guys are doing a great job. Just I support you. Great job. Keep hitting it. That's what the Gemara seems to say. Omer Dorsheni, we need Rishonim, we need Poskim, we need Achron. Let's continue. Let's get back into the sugya of Holich, but this time, and it's not super clear from the Gemara, but this time the Gemara is talking about a matana. We started out the sugya of Holech on the previous Amud talking about Holech of a mana leploni, and the language sounds the same here. Holech mana leploni, but in this case, we're not talking about a regular mana. What we are talking about is a matana. So Holech mana leploni, v'halachu bikshu v'lo mitzau. Let's say that I want to give a mana, I want to give $100 to a particular person, and my shliach is looking for him and can't find him. Turns out he died. So Tani Chada, one says that if we find out that he died, what should the shliach do with the money? I sent you out at 10 o'clock this morning with $100. You went to go find the recipient. When you got there, it was time for his funeral. The Gemara says, Yachzor l'mishalech. One brisa says it goes back to the sender, return to sender in our language. The Tanya Yidach, no, liyorshe mishin ishtalchu lo. No, if Reuven was sending to Shimon, Reuven doesn't get it back. Shimon's yorshim get it back. Wow, why? What's this machlokas all about? Perhaps we say Damar Savar Holech Kizachi. Maybe the halacha is that when you say Holech, it's as if the transaction already took place, and therefore it's no longer Reuven's; it belongs to Shimon. Shimon died. Okay, give it to his Yorshim. What are you supposed to do? That's because Holech is Kizachi. Umar Savar that Holech is Lav Kizachi. That maybe Holech is not really a transaction. And therefore, because Holech is not a transaction, it doesn't belong to Shimon or his Yorshim, and it's returned to sender. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Mamel, Dekule Alma Holech Lav Kizachi. That is not correct. Everybody holds that Holech in a vacuum is not binding. So why then do we have a scenario where maybe it goes to the Yorshim of Shimon, or maybe it goes back to sender? If it's a Shchiv Meira, the Shchiv Meira's words are very powerful. Yesterday we said they're Kiksuvim V'chimasurin Tamo. So therefore it's going to go to Shimon's Yorshim. But if he's a Bari, then the money will go right back to the sender. Rav Zvid argues and says, not really. We're halfway down on Yudal Amud Beis, heading to the end of the parak. Rav Zvid Amar, ha v'ha b'shchiv meira. Really, both brises are talking about b'shchiv meira. And ha de'isei lemekabel b'shas matan maos, that the mekabel was alive when the shchiv meira made his comment, and ha de'leisei lekabel b'shas matan maos. And one is when the mekabel, when Shimon was not alive during the time of the shchiv meira's comment. Yes, we know the shchiv meira's comments are always binding, but they're not binding on a dead man. So if Reuven said holech mana leploni as a shchiv meira, he wants to give it to Shimon. What he didn't realize is that at that time Shimon had already died. Then the money is returned to sender. But if Shimon was still alive, so then, yeah, absolutely, the holech is binding because he's a shchiv meira. And by a shchiv meira, his words are kiksuvin v'chimasurin damo. Rav Papa gives another answer. No, these two brises are Amar Hava Bari and Ha Demis Mekabel B'Chai Nosein, Ha Demis Nosein B'Chai Mekabel. Depends who died first. If the Mekabel died B'Chai Nosein, so then it goes back to sender. And if Demis Nosein B'Chai Mekabel, then it goes to the recipient. The Gemara says, adding a complicating factor, Lema Holech Kizchid Tanoihi. Maybe the argument of whether or not we say Holech is actually a binding commitment, that it actually works right away, maybe that's subject to a machlokes in the Tanoim. And here we're going to see, I believe it's 5 shitas in the Tanoim. The Tanya, what's the case? Holich mana leploni. If you say you commit, you say holich mana leploni, and v'halachu bikshu v'lo mitzao, and you can't find the person, so then yachzir lemishalech, it all goes back to sender. What if meis mishaleach, not the mekabel? What if the sender dies after he says this comment? Here is the machlokas. Reb Nasan v'Rav Yaakov amru yachzir liyorshe mishaleach. It goes back to the yorshim of the sender. Return to sender. He's dead. Fine. It goes to the sender's children. Let's call this person Reuven. V'yesh omrim, which is a nameless person. V'yesh omrim liyorshe mishin ishtalchu lo. No, it goes to the children who he was intending to send to Shimon's children. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Omer Amar Mishum Reb Yaakov Sha'amar Mishum Reb Meir, going back 3 generations. Mitzvah lekayim divrei hames. Really, it shouldn't go to the yorshim of Shimon, but unrelated to whether or not holich is kizachi, we have another din that it's a mitzvah to fulfill the dying wishes of a person, and therefore it goes to the yorshim of Shimon. The Chachamim omrim yachloku, reminiscent of the first Mishnah Maseches Bava Metzia. We don't know what to do. Split the funds. Half goes back to the original, and half goes back to the Mishalech, and half goes back to the Misha Mishalchot, who it was going to. V'kan amru, an odd language. V'kan amru means, Rashi says, bibavel. What's really odd about this is that this is a brisa. It's very odd. A brisa written in Bavel. That's not very common, no? I think most of the... Right. It's very odd. Okay, so the Gemara says, V'kan amru, kol masha yirtzeh shliach yatsa. We leave it up to the shliach. Well, it looks like my pockets have been lined. Obviously, that's not what it means. He gets to choose between the two. He only gets 2 choices. There's no third option. He has to choose the mishalech or the mishin ishtalech lo, and he has to make the decision on his own. And then this is very strange for those of us who've been learning Shas for the last, 1200 blot. This is, I believe, a first. Amar Reb Shimon Hanasi. Right. Yehuda Nasi we're familiar with. Shimon HaTzadik we're familiar with. Reb Shimon we're familiar with. Shimon HaNasi, a new name. The Gemara is going to ask about that soon. Al Yodi Hayamaisa, he says that something like this happened to me. The Amru, and whoever the Chachamim were at that time said, Yachzir liyorshe mishaleach. It goes back to the sender and to his children. So says the Gemara, these 5, 6 shitas, my lab b'hakamiflage. The Tanakama savar holech lav kizachi. The Tanakama says it's lav kizachi, that holech doesn't work. Reb Nasan, Reb Yaakov Nami holech lav kizachi. They agree that holech is not binding. The Afal Gav Demis, and even though he died, lo amrin and mitzvah l'kaim divrei hames, and they, Reb Nasan and Reb Yaakov, don't hold mitzvah l'kaim divrei hames, and the person who was the v'yesh omrim holds holech kizachi, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Amar Mishum Reb Yaakov Amar Mishum Reb Meir holech lav kizachi. Mihu, even though we hold that it's lav kizachi, hecha demisa amrin mitzvah l'kaim divrei hames, as we spoke about earlier. The Chachamim omrim yachloku misafkalu. They're torn about whether or not we say holech is kizachi. And v'kan amru, here in Bavel, what's the din? Shuda adi. If we prefer that the person use his own judgment. We have this phrase elsewhere, we've seen it already, Shuda Dedaini, where the person's making his own assessment. And Reb Shimon Anasi, Maisa Asa Lashmina, to teach what he holds. So maybe perhaps we can say that this 5, 6-pronged machlokas in the Tanaim over here is really a discussion of whether or not we hold holech is kizachi, and the shitas are across the boards. Some say holech is kizachi, and some say holech is not kizachi. And the Gemara, 5 lines from the bottom of Yodal and Bay says, lo, this is not a good comparison, and this is not what the machlokas is. Bibari, de kule alma lo pligi. Everyone agrees that when it comes to a case of bari, holech is lav kizachi. The Gemara doesn't articulate that, the Rishonim do. That when it comes to a bari, everyone agrees that holech is not strong enough. Okay, by shchiv meira we understand. What must we be talking about over here? We are talking about b'shchiv meira. We're talking about a person on his deathbed. By shchiv meira, we have all of these different shitas. Ubiplukta derbelazar v'rabbanon kemiflage. There's a connected, but we haven't learned it yet. A connected machlokas between Rebbe Lazar and the Rabbanon. What's that? Titnan. 4 lines from the bottom. Hamachalek nechasav al piv. Let's say that a person is sharing how to break up their Yerusha, their inheritance, but he didn't write anything down. He's just talking out loud. This car goes to that person, this farm goes to that child, this dog goes over there, and they're dividing up everything, but verbally. So this is a machlokes in the Tanaim. Rabbi Elazar Omer echad bari ve'echad mesukan. If the person is healthy or if the person is not healthy, even if he's a shchiv meira. So nechasim sheyesh lan achrayis. If it's things like ground that have achrayis, you're talking about a physical property. Niknin bekesef ubishtar bechazaka. Those acquisitions are made through a proper kinyan with money, with a document, or bechazaka. And if it's not property that can't be sold or stolen per se, it can only be given over. These are metaltalin. So these are she'en lan achrayis. These are physical objects. Ein niknin ela b'mashicha. You need to actually pull that item. That's the shita of Rebbe Lazar. The Chachamim Omrim, no, elu ve'elu niknin be'amira. I disagree with the shita of Rebbe Lazar, and these things can be niknin be'amira. That even if he is mechalik nechasav al piv, it works. And Amru lo Maisa be'iman shel b'nei Rochel. There was a mother of the b'nei Rochel. We'll discuss who they were in a minute. Shahisa chola. She was sick. The Amra tinasein kivinasi lebiti. Kivinasi, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says it's talking about Noshka. And if you take a look at the commentaries here, they say Tachshit Agul Munach Keneged Halev. It was a circular type of jewelry that was worn opposite the heart. So maybe some type of circular piece of jewelry that was on a string that was worn opposite a woman's heart. So that was what she said. This mother says that Tinasein Kivinasi, I want to give this jewelry, Labiti, to my daughter. And it was very expensive. So this is beautiful. We see a raya berura that a person can be mechalek al piv. So says the Gemara, Omar lahem the Chachamim pushed back and said, B'nei Rochel tikbareim ima. The children of Rochel, are you crazy? These people were ashamed. Their mother should bury them. This is not a very complimentary phrase, but if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says tikbareim imam. First and second lines. Klalahi klomar lo yalu al halev, lo yizkru bebeis hamedrash l'raya lefi sherushaim hayu shoyim mekayim kotzim bekerem v'chule. They were terrible people. You can't bring a raya from there. So perhaps we can say that the Tanakama is Rebbe Lazar, and perhaps we could say that Reb Nassan, Reb Yaakov is Nami Rebbe Lazar. He also holds like Rebbe Lazar. However, Afal Gav Demis Lo Amrinan Mitzvah L'Kaim Divrei Hameis, but they don't hold that a dying man's wishes should be fulfilled. The sheet of the V'yei Shomer is Kirabanan, like we just saw, that Be'amira works. Reb Yehuda Nasi Shomer Mishum Reb Meir Rebbe Lazar, he holds the Chomer like Rebbe Lazar that it doesn't work. Miu Hecha Demis, but even though it's true that the transaction doesn't work, but Amrinan Mitzvah L'Kaim Divrei Hameis, but the Chachamim, Reb Yehuda Nasi, I should say, in the name of Reb Meir, holds that we still are Mekayim Divrei Hameis. The Chachamim omrim in that brayso Yachloku because Mesafka, we don't know if he held like Reb Elazar or the Chachamim. The Kanam, or the people in Bavel, held Shuda Adif. And then Reb Shimon Hanasi Maisa Asal Ashmuina. So the Gemara seems to conclude that there is a link between this brayso and our machlokes between Reb Elazar and the Chachamim. Two small things before we end. Bayalahu. Reb Shimon Hanasi, who was this? Nasihu o mishmei de Nasi ka'amar. Was Reb Shimon HaNasi one of the Nasiim, and we just never see his name? His name has been left out. Or no, is it Reb Shimon in the name of a Nasi? The Gemara says Tashma. What's the problem? The Amar of Yosef, the Rav Yosef quotes a brayso. Halacha ki Reb Shimon HaNasi. Says the Gemara, that's not a raya. You use the same exact name in a different sentence. And says the Gemara, Teku. We don't know if Shimon HaNasi was a real person himself, if he was a Nasi himself, or he was just speaking on behalf of a Nasi, unclear. Gufa, says the Gemara, we had learned the halacha just a line ago. Amar of Yosef, halacha kirib Shimon HaNasi. Says the Gemara, halacha kirib Shimon HaNasi. What does that mean? What did Reb Shimon HaNasi say? So Reb Shimon HaNasi told us this story. Let's go back on the bottom of the previous page and see what he said. Reb Shimon HaNasi said that they gave the money, the Yorshe HaMeshalech, that the money went back to the Yorshim of the sender. Says the Gemara, how can that be true? How can Shimon HaNasi say that the money goes back to the sender? Hare, we have a halacha. If we're dealing with a shchiv meira, then there's no reason why the money should go back to the sender. The money should always go to Shimon and to his family, who's the recipient. So Rav Yosef Mukila Bebari, Rav Yosef says that therefore it has to be that the brayso where Shimon HaNasi is talking about a bari, talking about a healthy person, and that's why it goes back to the Mishalech. But he agrees that by a shchiv meira, that the words of a shchiv meira are kiksuvim mechimasurim damo. Says the Gemara, "V'hala yorshe mishaleach ka'amar v'kaimal on mitzvah l'kaim divrei hames." Even if you want to say that, that fine, and we're talking about a case of a bari. What about the halacha l'kaim on mitzvah l'kaim divrei hames? At the end of the day, he died, so we should fulfill his words. Says the Gemara, "Tini yachzeru l'mishaleach," that it should go back to the mishaleach, to the sender, and we're not going to be Makayim Divrei Hames. Hadron Allah maybe Kama Baruch Hashem. We finished the first perek of Maseches Gittin. Mir Hashem will pick up tomorrow with another daf. However, tomorrow's daf will not be in person. I'll be recording and posting Mir Hashem in the morning hours. Wishing you all a beautiful night. Back together on Thursday.